They mocked him for the color of his skin, laughed at his age, and treated him like he didn't belong. Two officers, drunk with authority, pushed an elderly black man toward the edge of humiliation and right into a pool. But in less than 60 seconds, their smug smiles vanished, because they didn't just shove a man, they disrespected someone whose name could end their careers with a single phone call. What happened next silenced the entire crowd. The sun was warm and steady, casting a soft golden hue across the sparkling surface of the resort's grand swimming pool. Laughter danced in the air, blending with the gentle splashes of families enjoying their afternoon. Cabana shades lined the perimeter, each one housing vacationers sipping cold drinks and soaking in the good life. The atmosphere was one of leisure and ease, the kind of place where problems didn't seem to exist, at least not for everyone. An elderly black man strolled slowly toward the poolside, his steps measured and calm. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, pressed slacks, and a pale linen shirt, the outfit of someone who valued grace even in the smallest things. His gait bore the signs of age, the slight stiffness in his knees, the deliberate care in his movements. But his posture remained upright, proud. There was dignity in the way he carried himself, even in silence. But not everyone saw dignity. From a distance, two women stood beneath the shade of a white umbrella. Dressed in crisp white police uniforms, they appeared relaxed, off-duty, but still wearing the aura of authority like perfume. Their sunglasses hid their eyes, but not the smirks that played across their lips as they watched the elderly man approach the pool area. One leaned slightly toward the other, murmuring something that made them both chuckle under their breath. They saw the man, but they didn't really see him. What they saw was a story they thought they knew, a lone, older black man at an upscale resort. To them, it didn't add up. He didn't belong, not in their eyes, not without a reason. The assumptions began immediately. Was he lost? Trespassing? One of the staff's relatives maybe? Or worse, someone trying to sneak in for a free swim? Their minds were already racing with stereotypes, their biases so deeply ingrained they didn't even recognize them as such. One of the officers leaned back with a lazy stretch and pulled off her sunglasses, eyeing the man more closely now. She whispered something again, and they both laughed once more, this time louder. The man remained oblivious, or perhaps he was simply ignoring the stares. He had walked through too many lifetimes of judgment to be fazed by a couple of chuckles. This was not the first time he'd been watched with suspicion. Not the first time he'd walked into a place where people acted like he didn't deserve to exist in their world. But he kept walking, his head held high. Around them, other guests noticed the officer's behavior. Some looked away, unwilling to get involved. A few exchanged glances, sensing something was off, but unsure whether to act. The mood began to shift slightly, like a faint gust of wind passing through a still day. Something felt wrong. Not yet loud enough to disrupt the moment, but just loud enough to be noticed. As the man neared the pool, he paused, pulling a clean white towel from a nearby lounge chair. He looked around, taking in the setting. His eyes softened at the sight of the water. There was a quiet familiarity in them, like someone remembering something they hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was just the memory of stillness. Either way, he looked content, until the officers started walking toward him. They didn't approach with kindness or even curiosity. They approached with entitlement. Their strides were confident, too confident. One of them called out with a fake sweetness in her voice, asking if he needed help. But the tone didn't match the words. There was no offer in her voice, only challenge. The kind that comes from someone who already believes they know the answer and is just waiting for you to confirm it. The man didn't respond right away. He turned his head slowly, his expression calm, unreadable. That lack of reaction seemed to agitate the officers. The second one stepped closer, asking again, louder this time, if he was supposed to be there. It wasn't really a question. It was a test. He nodded gently, offering a polite smile. "I'm here to relax," he said simply. But that wasn't enough. The first officer tilted her head. "Do you have a room key?" she asked. The tone was sharper now, the sweetness gone. Behind her sunglasses, her eyes were hard. The man reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out a small leather card holder. He opened it and displayed a gold-plated access card, the kind reserved for elite guests of the resort. The shimmer of it should have been enough to silence them, but it didn't. The moment had already passed the point of no return. They had judged him, mocked him, and now they were looking for justification. Their arrogance didn't waver. If anything, it grew stronger, a twisted defense mechanism. They had convinced themselves he didn't belong, and they were going to prove it, no matter what it took. The man returned the card to his pocket and turned toward the pool again, as if trying to resume his quiet day. But the officers weren't finished. They exchanged a glance, as if daring each other to take the next step, and then, without warning, one of them moved behind him, fast and invasive. It was no longer just another day. It was about to become a moment the world would never forget. The laughter started quietly, a smug exchange between two women in uniform who believed their authority placed them above decency. It was the kind of laugh not born from humor, but from a twisted sense of superiority, the sound of people so convinced of their own importance, they mistook cruelty for control. The elderly man stood silently by the pool's edge, having shown his gold access card, yet their behavior only intensified. They weren't satisfied with proof. They wanted submission. One of the officers leaned in, pretending to inspect his card again, even though she had seen it clearly moments earlier. She squinted, turning the card back and forth dramatically in her hand, then shrugged. "Could have picked this up off the ground," she said sarcastically, tossing it back to him without care. The other chuckled and crossed her arms. "Yeah, doesn't really mean anything unless you have an ID to match. Do you even have one?" Her voice was loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A few people glanced over, uncertain whether to step in, but the uniforms made everyone hesitate. These weren't just two women causing a scene. They were law enforcement, or at least carried themselves like it, and that gave them a shield that kept most people quiet. The old man remained still, choosing silence over reaction. His composure unnerved them. It denied them the reaction they were baiting him into, and that only made them press harder. "You know," one of them said, "we've had reports of some people try and sneak into the resort from the nearby park. Happens more than you'd think. Some of them even look like they belong." She dragged the word "look out" just long enough to make her meaning crystal clear. The other one nodded with a smirk. "Yeah, they always try to act like they're guests. Try to blend in with the rich folks. But there's always something off. Like too confident, too calm. Like they're trying to hide they don't belong." The insult hung heavy in the air. It wasn't coded. It wasn't subtle. It was designed to break him down, to make him shrink. But he didn't. He remained upright, eyes steady, lips sealed. That defiance, even in silence, was too much for them. "You're awful quiet," one of them snapped. "What's the matter? Can't out your tongue? Or are you just ignoring us?" Her voice rose with each word, now fully performing for the people nearby. Then she took a step closer and jabbed a finger toward his chest. "Let's see your ID. Not that fancy card, your real ID." The man reached into his back pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. But as he pulled out his wallet, the other officer suddenly stepped behind him and snatched it from his hand. The move was unnecessary and aggressive, a deliberate power play. She flipped through it with mock interest. Well, what do we have here?" she said loudly, shaking her head. "Nope. Still doesn't prove anything. For all we know, this could be fake too. Don't think that just because you've got a little plastic card, you can walk around here like you own the place." The man raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Her words were insulting, yes, but there was something deeper beneath them, something darker. A refusal to accept his dignity, his presence, his right to be there. They didn't want to just question him. They wanted to shame him. The first officer leaned in again. "You know what?" she said, with an exaggerated grin. "Maybe you should cool off. All this tension isn't good for an old man's heart." Her partner caught on instantly. Without warning, she grabbed the man's arm from behind, gripping it tightly. The old man's body tensed, surprised but still trying to maintain calm. But before he could say a word, the other officer took hold of his other arm. In one synchronized motion, they began to lead, or more accurately, drag, him toward the edge of the pool. A few people gasped. A child clutched their parent's hand. The sound of chairs scraping across the concrete echoed, but no one moved to intervene. The old man's shoes scraped against the surface, trying not to stumble. He didn't resist with violence, didn't shout or scream. But there was a change in his eyes now, not fear, not even anger, but a deep sadness, a quiet knowing, the pain of being seen and still not being seen. "You ladies better let go." A voice finally called from the crowd, but it was weak, uncertain, easily drowned out by the sound of splashing water just inches away. "You think this is funny?" One officer sneered. "Let's see how funny you look wet." And with one final shove, masked as playful roughness, they pushed him forward. The water exploded upward as he fell in. The ripples spread out like shock waves. Their laughter followed seconds later. But in those few seconds between the splash and the silence, something shifted, something none of them could take back. And someone had just seen everything. The water splashed high, a wave of cold engulfing the old man's body as he hit the pool. The laughter that followed wasn't just cruel, it was triumphant. The officers stood by the poolside, amused with themselves, dusting off their uniforms as if they had done something noble. A few people giggled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or intervene. Others remained frozen, paralyzed by the sight of authority behaving in ways it never should. The elderly man surfaced slowly. Water streamed down his face as he held the edge of the pool. His chest rose and fell, not from exertion, but from the weight of humiliation. He said nothing, didn't even glare back. The silence he held was louder than any scream, more cutting than any insult. But still the officers smirked, satisfied. In their eyes, they had neutralized a threat, maintained control, reminded someone of their place. But they didn't realize who had just watched everything. Not far from the pool, a man in a dark suit had been sitting in a lounge chair, sunglasses shading sharp eyes that missed nothing. He hadn't moved during the incident. He hadn't spoken. But every word, every smirk, every shove had been noted. Every ounce of disrespect was now burning into memory. He removed his glasses slowly, revealing eyes that didn't blink. The old man in the pool was more than just a guest. He was a father, and not just to any man, but to someone whose name was known across military ranks, someone whose presence could silence an entire battlefield. A man trained to operate in the darkest corners of the world, with skills most could only imagine. His name wasn't one you found in news articles or flashy interviews. He lived in the shadows by choice, his career crafted in quiet precision. But this was personal. The poolside was no longer just a leisure area. It was a crime scene of arrogance, and justice had already begun to take root in the eyes of the man rising from his chair. As the old man pulled himself out of the water, the officers backed away slightly, their amusement waning. Something was changing. The air grew heavier. The energy around them shifted, like the air before a storm. Guests who had previously stayed silent now looked uneasy. Phones began to record, but more importantly, whispers started. Curious ones, worried ones. Eyes weren't just on the soaked elder anymore. They were darting around, as if sensing something monumental was about to happen. The old man, soaked and dignified, stood upright. He wiped the water from his brow and adjusted the collar of his shirt. He still didn't speak, but behind him, another figure began to approach, calm, calculated, and cold. Each step this man took was deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply moved like someone who had no reason to hurry, because he already controlled the outcome. People parted in his path instinctively, not because they knew who he was yet, but because something primal in them said, "Make way." The officers turned to look at him, confused. They weren't familiar with him, not yet, but something about the way he stared at them made their backs straighten. "Is there a problem, sir?" one asked, her voice faltering for the first time that day. He didn't respond. Instead, his eyes dropped to his father, now toweled off by a concerned guest. His jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't break composure. He finally looked at the badge on the woman's chest. "Your name," he said evenly. She blinked. "Excuse me." "Your name." "And hers too." The other officer stiffened. "We were just following protocol, sir." The man couldn't provide valid credentials. "He did," the man replied, cutting her off. I watched him from the moment he walked in. The words struck them like a slap. They began to piece it together now. How long had he been there? Had he seen it all? Why hadn't he said anything? Listen, one of them began. We didn't mean to cause any harm. If he's with you, he's not with me, the man said firmly. I'm with him. They stared, not comprehending. He took one step closer. That man you threw in the pool, that man you mocked and manhandled raised me, trained me, built me. You couldn't match an inch of his discipline if you trained for a decade. The officers were no longer confident. Their faces fell, visibly shaken. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You'll know who I am soon enough. And so will your department. That was all he said before turning back toward his father, who looked at him with eyes not of surprise, but of unspoken pride. What had started as public humiliation had just transformed into a reckoning, not of fists or fury, but of consequences. And the clock had already started ticking. The sound of tires crunching over gravel was sudden and sharp, drawing every eye toward the entrance of the facility. A sleek black SUV pulled up with a quiet authority that didn't need sirens or flashing lights to command attention. Its windows were tinted, the kind used by those who needed privacy not because they were afraid, but because they were powerful enough not to care what anyone thought. The front door opened first, and two suited security personnel stepped out swiftly, scanning the area with practiced precision. They weren't local guards or private mall security. They moved like men who had trained for scenarios the public would never know existed. Whispers swept across the crowd like a windstorm. Everyone could feel it. Something monumental was happening, something that would be talked about long after the sun set. The atmosphere had changed from awkward tension to full-blown suspense. Every passerby, every guest, every hotel employee sensed it. This wasn't just some wealthy executive visiting the pool. This was something much larger. Then the rear door opened, and out stepped a man whose face was known in high-stakes circles across continents, but remained a mystery to the average civilian. Not because he hid, but because he didn't need fame. Influence was more valuable. He was the type of man who met with world leaders behind closed doors, who held keys to operations far beyond ordinary comprehension. His name carried weight in boardrooms and in war zones. Some called him a ghost. Others called him a shadow king. But those who really knew him, they called him the reason why certain powers didn't sleep soundly. He didn't rush. His tailored suit moved with him as if stitched by the wind. Every step was intentional. His eyes scanned the area and locked onto his father, who now stood dignified, still dripping from his uncalled-for plunge into the pool. The security men followed a step behind, not out of protection, but respect. By now, the officers who had initiated the chaos earlier stood frozen. Their faces, which had once worn smug grins, were now masks of panic. The badge didn't feel like a shield anymore. It felt like a target. The realization hit them not all at once, but in layers. This wasn't just any man. This wasn't just any father. This was the patriarch of a legacy that extended far beyond anything they could comprehend. And the son? He had arrived not with threats, but with presence. And that presence said everything. The resort manager appeared from a side entrance, sweating profusely despite the air conditioning. He'd seen the headlines before, the whispers in business circles, the stories of how this man had taken down entire corrupt boards, vanished traffickers, exposed international scandals. And now he stood at his pool, his father soaking wet, disrespected, humiliated. The manager was already dialing his phone before he could process the fallout. As the powerful son approached, the security team subtly shifted formation. One of them whispered into a mic calls were being made, but not to 911. These were calls that bypassed police chiefs and went straight to federal desks. Chains of command were unraveling in real time. The officers tried to muster composure. We didn't know," one of them stammered, her voice trembling. "You didn't ask," he responded, his voice steady like a loaded weapon. They tried to justify themselves again, talking over each other, stumbling through apologies. But none of it mattered. The moment they chose prejudice over patience, assumption over inquiry, they'd already lost. The man didn't yell, didn't posture, didn't threaten. His silence was worse. It was the kind that buried reputations. The manager stepped forward, trying to smooth the situation, offering apologies like they could erase what had already been done. He spoke about misunderstandings, policies, confusion, but none of it landed. The weight of what had occurred wasn't just about one incident. It was about the message sent, the values revealed, the ignorance exposed. The son walked past them all, straight to his father. He took off his suit jacket, placed it gently around his father's shoulders, and stood beside him, not in pity, not in rage, but in unity, in love, in a bond that said, "You raised me to be calm in the chaos, calculated under pressure, and now the world will learn what that truly means." Then, finally, he spoke. "This facility," he said quietly, "will change ownership by morning." The words stunned everyone. He continued, "I've already contacted the resort group shareholders. They've accepted my offer. Effective immediately, this establishment is under my control. And these two officers—" He glanced toward the pale, trembling pair. "They'll be escorted off the premises by private security. Their badges will be revoked before sundown." The resort manager gasped. The officers looked like ghosts. But the crowd, the guests, they erupted into quiet, shocked awe. Because justice had arrived, not through anger, not through violence, but through power handled with dignity. The kind of power that didn't just punish, it transformed. And with that, the tide turned completely. The truth had hit hard, and it had only just begun. The ripples of the confrontation had barely begun to settle when the final truth unfolded, not through a dramatic speech or viral video, but through a quiet series of revelations that left everyone stunned. The elderly man, once dismissed as just another nameless face, was not only the father of the man who had just bought the entire resort. He was a hero in his own right, a decorated war veteran with honors few civilians could even comprehend, a man who had once led battalions through enemy lines and rescued hundreds under fire, a man whose name was engraved in the military archives not as a statistic, but as a legend. The irony was sharp. The very freedom the officers were sworn to uphold had been preserved decades ago by the man they had just tried to humiliate. Documents surfaced, old newspaper articles, presidential medals, photos of him standing beside generals and world leaders, back when the world was still black and white and wars weren't fought on screens, but in the trenches. His legacy had been forgotten by time, maybe by design, but not by fate, and certainly not by his son, who had built empires not for pride, but to honor the man who raised him. The staff at the resort were the first to respond. The same employees who had stood frozen now moved swiftly to bring towels, offer apologies, and lower their heads in shame. But he asked for none of it. His only wish was that no one else would ever be treated the same way. The media got wind of the story within hours. At first, it was just a tweet. Someone from the pool area had posted about a powerful man buying out a hotel after his dad was disrespected. But then photos began to circulate. Images of the old man soaked in quiet, now revealed to be a war hero. The narrative flipped overnight. The story wasn't about the disrespect anymore. It was about the resilience, the strength, the grace under fire again. By morning, headlines flooded every corner of the internet. Veteran humiliated at resort, son buys entire property. War hero targeted by officers, ends up their employer. Legacy of honor-shame system of assumption. The public, once known for short attention spans, couldn't look away. Not because the story was dramatic, but because it exposed something deep. A collective reflection. A mirror too sharp to ignore. The two officers, whose arrogance had kicked off the entire situation, were gone. Their careers ended not with an explosion, but with quiet dismissal. There were no protests, no debates. Even their own departments distanced themselves. The message was clear. Assumptions had consequences. And prejudice, no matter how subtle, would always be a ticking time bomb. But the man, he didn't seek revenge. He didn't ask for punishment. His son, now in control of the property, asked him what he wanted to do with the place. Sell it, rebrand it, shut it down? Instead, he said something that left everyone stunned. Keep it open. Make it better. He wanted change, not closure. And so the resort underwent a transformation, not just in ownership, but in mission. A new plaque was installed near the pool, not to commemorate the incident, but to remind everyone who stepped foot there of the values that should never be forgotten: dignity, patience, and respect. Underneath, a simple inscription read, "To all who are overlooked, we see you." Programs were launched. Veterans received discounts. Anti-bias training was mandated. The entire staff went through immersive education programs designed not by PR teams, but by grassroots organizations the elderly man had worked with for decades. He poured his experience into reform, not retribution. His pain became a blueprint. Guests returned. New ones arrived. The story made the resort iconic, but it was the warmth that kept people coming back. The place no longer just offered luxury. It offered perspective. A space where stories mattered, where people paused before judging, listened before acting. The father never boasted about the incident. When asked, he always redirected the conversation to the bigger picture. "It wasn't about me," he'd say. "It was about everyone who's ever been made to feel small for no reason. If this had happened to me for someone else to be treated better tomorrow, then so be it." The world had seen too many viral moments dissolve into nothing, but this one lingered. It stayed because it mattered, because it wasn't about spectacle, it was about truth. A truth that didn't scream, but stood tall and refused to be ignored any longer. Respect wasn't demanded, it was reclaimed. And through it, a nation took one small step closer to remembering what it meant to see each other, not by skin or age or silence, but by story. If this story moved you, if it made you pause and think, even for a moment, then it's time to make that moment count. At Expect Stories, we bring you powerful, untold tales that reveal the strength behind silence, the truth behind injustice, and the transformation that begins when dignity is reclaimed. Don't let stories like this go unheard. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to Expect Stories backhand index pointing right. Like, if this story stirred something inside you, backhand index pointing right. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Respect is never optional, backhand index pointing right. And comment below what you felt, because your voice matters too. This is just one of many stories we're telling. The next one might be the one you'll never forget.